Good morning. Thanks for joining us for the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, Preventative Controls Rule Hazard Analysis webinar. We are pleased to have Dr. Erin DiCaprio with us again from the University of California, Davis, as well as Dr. Stephanie Smith from Washington State University, Scott Rice from the Washington State Department of Agriculture Organic Program, and Jacob Guth and Anna Rivas from the CCOF Certification Services Food Safety Program. So we're going to get started with the webinar presentation shortly, but first I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. And just a note, we're going to turn the videos off during the presentation, but we'll come back on during the question and answer sessions. We just wanted to let you know there are faces behind the voices. We're just not echoes on the internet. So we will start with our housekeeping items and then move on to dig into some hazard analysis. So my name is Megan Donovan. I'll be your host today. Behind the scenes, we have Larissa Hernandez providing technical assistance. She'll be the one fielding questions when they come in and may hop on as an alternative host if any technical issues should arise. And the CCOF Foundation is pleased to collaborate with our partners to host today's webinar. Guided by the wisdom of our farming roots, the CCOF Foundation unites the organic community to advance organic agriculture. We offer intentional education, financial support, and growth opportunities for organic professionals. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a food safety outreach program grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA. And also note the webinar is not providing legal advice. This is the fifth webinar in our 9-part Food Safety for Organic Food Processors series. If you missed any of the previous webinars, visit the CCOF website for links to the recordings. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And finally, I'm going to do a quick Zoom tutorial. I think quite familiar with Zoom at this point, but sometimes there's little things that I'm still learning, so we're just going to do a quick little review. To see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in full screen mode and would like to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit Full Screen Mode to exit the full screen. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or to communicate with our webinar staff, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the shared screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Write your questions or comments in the field at the bottom of the box and click send. If you would like to send your question anonymously, check the Send Anonymously box on the left. Note, we will not be using the chat function during this webinar, so send all messages via the question and answer box. And feel free to send in questions at any time. We'll collect those during the presentation and then answer them during the question and answer breaks. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our webinar evaluation survey will pop up. To take a survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions to help us improve our offerings. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CCOF YouTube channel. We will send a link to the recording along with a PDF of the slides to all webinar registrants. And so just to let you know too, we had over 100 people sign up for this webinar, so we are expecting a pretty good crowd. So we're going to try to get to as many questions or comments as we can today. But if we don't get to your specific question, just follow up with us after the webinar. So with that, I would like to introduce today's lead trainer, Dr. Erin DiCaprio is an assistant specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. Her area of expertise is microbial food safety with an emphasis on foodborne viruses. And as I mentioned earlier, joining Erin today, we have Dr. Stephanie Smith from Washington State University, Scott Rice from the WSDA Organic Program, as well as Jacob Guth and Anna Rivas from CCOF Certification Services Food Safety Program. And they'll be jumping in from time to answer questions related to their area of expertise. So with that, Erin, I will hand things over to you.
Thanks, Megan, and welcome everyone. Excited to talk to you today about hazard analysis. It can be, if you're new to the food processing, the food safety realm, this can be something rather challenging to jump into the first time. So hopefully after today, you'll have a better sense of how to approach hazard analysis. And we're hoping to leave you with some tools today to be able to, implement this type of process for your business. So generally what we're going to go through today is first an overview of the different types and sources of hazards that need to be addressed during the hazard analysis. And then we're going to walk through 3 different product types and their hazard analysis to give you kind of a better sense of the application of hazard analysis for different food types and processes. I did also just want to briefly discuss here kind of the difference between a traditional HACCP plan and the food safety plan that's required under the FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. So for those of you that may have been in the business for quite some time, you've probably been indoctrinated with the HACCP system, which prior to the Food Safety Modernization Act regulation was a set of HACCP regulations were developed for specific food types. Those include USDA regulated products, meat and poultry, for example, have HACCP regulations, but also a few FDA regulated food products, including seafood and juice. So those product types have a separate regulation that applies to them. So the HACCP system is based on, this hazard analysis process as well. And so what we found was many other businesses that were producing food also adopted that HACCP system that is, again, based on doing this hazard analysis and implementing critical control points in their process to address specific hazards that were identified during the hazard analysis. So as the Food Safety Modernization Act, Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule was developed, it leaned very heavily on those pre-existing HACCP regulations, but also expanded a bit on the types of preventive controls, which would be called critical control points under that HACCP system that processors needed to address. So under the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, we have an addition to what are called process controls, which would be under the HACCP system, those critical control points. We also have preventive controls that are required for allergens, supply chain, and sanitation, which may or may not be implemented based on the outcome of your hazard analysis. And so I think it can be confusing because I think kind of across the board, people still refer to food safety plans as HACCP plans, but just know if you are a processor that's making a food that is not meat, poultry, juice, or seafood, that you're going to be covered by the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. And there are a few other types of preventive controls you may need to implement based on your hazard analysis. So let's go ahead and jump into it here. So under the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule, there are several definitions that I want to highlight here. And so this process of hazard analysis, this is a systematic approach by which you'll go through each step of the production process and identify all potential hazards that may exist at each individual step in the process. And during that hazard identification process, you will identify certain hazards that will be considered to be known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, which are biological, chemical, or physical hazards that are known to be or have a very strong probability of being associated with that particular food or the processing environment or facility. So of those identified, known, or reasonably foreseeable hazards, some of them, maybe not all, are going to require a preventive control. And again, under the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule, that could be a process preventive control. So something like a thermal treatment to inactivate a biological hazard that's been identified. It could be an allergen preventive control, so verifying that an allergen is on a label of a food product that contains an allergen. It could be a supply chain preventive control where you've identified an ingredient you're sourcing as having a particular hazard associated with it, but you're relying on the supplier of that ingredient to control for the hazard. Or it could be a sanitation preventive control. So if you've identified that there's a risk of an environmental pathogen cross-contaminating that food product, you would implement a sanitation control to minimize that cross-contamination risk. So the determination of whether a hazard requires a preventive control is based on the severity of the outcome to an individual should that hazard not be controlled, and also the probability of that hazard occurring in that food product without implementing a preventive control. So it does take prior experience and knowledge of, say, food manufacturing to be able to make these determinations. So this can be really challenging for someone new to the food industry that doesn't have that experience or knowledge coming in. But hopefully we're going to leave you again with some tools to be able to utilize in making those determinations. So the preventive control that's going to be applied is going to have to be appropriate to the product and the facility and based on the current scientific understanding of how to control that particular hazard. So we're going to have more to come on that last statement about the scientific understanding in our next webinar that's focused on validation, which is also a requirement for any process preventive control I identified as a need. So this validation process is essentially the process of gathering the scientific evidence or data that whatever process preventive control you're implementing will in fact mitigate the risk associated with the hazard that you're targeting. So to briefly, set the stage for the hazard analysis, I want to go through the hazard types that need to be considered, and those include the biological, and physical, and chemical hazards. So we'll go through that really quickly here in the beginning. So biological hazards are those associated primarily with pathogenic microorganisms. So here on this slide, these are the major groups of microorganisms found in food. And of these groups, there are pathogenic types of bacteria, parasites, and viruses that must be considered during your hazard analysis. There are some types of molds that can produce mycotoxins if they grow in foods. However, mycotoxins are considered a chemical hazard, not a biological one, which can be a little bit confusing. I also want to highlight that there are non-pathogenic bacteria, yeast, and molds that can contribute to food spoilage. So a product that is spoiled is also considered adulterated, meaning it's illegal to sell that product, even though a spoiled food doesn't necessarily pose a risk to human health. So it is important, of course, to control the growth of these spoilage microbes for a food processor, though they're not a focus of the hazard analysis piece. So pathogenic microorganisms can be introduced through many mechanisms during food production. So they can come in on raw ingredients. They might contaminate a food contact surface. They can come in on pests that enter the facility, and there are many other sources beyond that. So there are several programs that are going to fall under current good manufacturing practices, or the GMPs, that aim to minimize the introduction of pathogenic microorganisms into a food facility or the food. And these would include things like your employee hygiene practices, cleaning and sanitation, ingredient storage requirements, sanitary facility and equipment design, things like that fall under the blanket of GMPs. So it's really critically important that these good manufacturing practices are properly implemented to help minimize the risks associated with biological hazards. And in some cases, during hazard analysis, if you identify a biological hazard at a particular step, you may not need to implement a preventive control because your good manufacturing practices should be controlling for the introduction of that particular biological hazard at that particular step. So a common example of that would be if you've identified potential pathogen contamination by a food handler who maybe is, packaging your food product by hand. So if you're implementing proper personal hygiene practices, as outlined by good manufacturing practices, then in that instance, that hazard would be controlled by good manufacturing practices, and you would not need to implement a preventive control at that particular step. But there are going to be many cases where a preventive control would be required for a biological hazard. So a common example would be a thermal treatment of a food product, which would be a process preventive control that's applied to inactivate pathogens identified during the hazard analysis. So the survival or growth of microbial pathogens in food is influenced by 6 key factors of the food product that include the nutrient sources available in that food for the microorganisms to grow, the acidity or pH of the food, the temperature at which the food is processed and or stored, the time that the food is exposed to different temperatures or environmental conditions, the availability of oxygen in the food product during storage, and the water activity of the food. So I want to just define here briefly water activity. So this is not the same as moisture content. So water activity is the amount of free water in a product that's available for microorganisms to utilize for their own metabolism. And so the water activity can be reduced by physically removing water from a product by dehydrating or baking, but you can also reduce the water activity by adding solutes, so things like salt or sugar that will bind water in the food matrix and make it unavailable for use by microorganisms to grow. So the product formulation can impact all of these factors, and manipulation of these factors. For example, adding acid to a product to lower the pH, lowering the water activity by adding salt, or adding preservatives to a product. These may be preventive controls applied in the product formulation to control a particular biological hazard. So if you are, for example, acidifying salsa, you need to control that acidification process to make sure that you are getting to your target pH that is going to control for Clostridium botulinum potential growth in that salsa product, for example. Processing, including thermal processing, so using heat as well as non-thermal processing, like high pressure, is another type of process control that can be applied to control a biological hazard. So if you're making salsa, you'll be adding some acid to reduce the pH to control for Clostridium botulinum growth, assuming this is a canned shelf-stable salsa product. But you'd also be applying a pasteurization step of that jar to inactivate other biological hazards that might be present in that product. And then finally, how a product is stored can also be a preventive control that's critical for controlling the growth of biological hazards. So if you're working with a refrigerated product, maintaining that cold chain may be a preventive control for minimizing pathogen growth in that product. So you need to be thinking about your particular product and how you're manipulating the formulation, how you're processing, how you're packaging and storing that product, and determine which steps in the formulation, processing, storage might be a preventive control for your biological hazards. So physical hazards are another category of hazards that need to be addressed during this hazard analysis process. And these are any extraneous objects that, if found in a food, can cause illness or injury to a person consuming that product. So foreign objects, they're the most obvious evidence of a contaminated product, and they're one that if it occurs in your product, you're likely going to hear from a consumer because they know when they bite down on one of these physical hazards, and they'll often file a complaint related to the occurrence of physical hazards in food products. But these hazards, they're also less likely than the chemical or biological contaminants to affect large numbers of people. So it's rare to have a whole lot of product leaving a facility that's contaminated with a physical hazard, just because of the nature of the sources of these hazards. So you can see here a list of different physical hazards. And the sources of these physical hazards can be variable. So of course they can come in raw materials. For example, shells might be present in almonds that you're using in a product. So these shells may cause damage to teeth if they were incorporated into a product and then consumed. So in this case, it would be important that a supply chain control is established to minimize physical hazards in incoming raw ingredients. In most cases, pieces of shells are going to be removed by the supplier during sorting, and they're, most large-scale suppliers are going to have very sophisticated equipment utilized to remove, these physical hazards. I'd also say that most consumer-grade products are going to be produced in a manner to minimize the presence of physical hazards. So if you happen to be sourcing ingredients from a grocery store or a local market, those ingredients, would not be a likely source of a physical hazard. Within your facility, poorly maintained equipment or the facility in general can be a source of physical hazards. We find frequently that improperly maintained mixing equipment can result in metal on metal or metal on plastic contact. that can result in shearing or metal or plastic fragments that are generated during that mixing process. Also, sometimes there are pieces of the equipment like screws or springs that can end up in a product if that equipment's not properly maintained. So preventive maintenance does reduce the occurrence of this issue. But many larger scale processors that have identified this metal on metal contact as an issue will employ metal detection as a process preventive control for that metal hazard. Smaller processors likely are not going to have the capacity to install a metal detector. Just to kind of give an example here, we have a pilot processing facility in the food science department here at UC Davis. And for Picnic Day, which is kind of a campus community celebration that's held every spring, our students make ice cream to serve to the folks visiting campus. And we use a scrape surface heat exchanger to make our ice cream. But there's potential in that heat exchanger for metal on metal contact and shearing. So our process preventive control is to conduct a pre-run inspection of that equipment to make sure all the metal parts are intact. And then post-production, we fully break down the equipment and inspect again to ensure that all the metal is intact and no shearing has occurred. So that's our metal process preventive control for our small scale ice cream production. So employees are often a source of physical hazards as well. So this is why, folks aren't allowed to wear jewelry or, clothing that has buttons that might accidentally drop off into a food product. So these are things covered by good manufacturing practices. So implementing those is really critical for minimizing the occurrence of physical hazards where some of your employees might be a source. And then I also want to highlight here that glass is a physical hazard, and that if you're packaging your product in glass, then you must identify glass as a physical hazard requiring a preventive control during your hazard analysis. So if you are packaging in glass, you need to have a glass control program for your facility. So this could include inspection of your glass containers when you receive them, as well as looking for any breakage post-production during final package inspection. And then you should also have a plan in place for what to do in the instance when you do have some glass breakage during a production run. So having, those lot-to-lot inspections and a plan for what happens if you do have a lot of product that could be impacted by glass is really important, because we don't have a great detection method for glass hazard in a final packaged food product. So here's a table that provides a bit more detail on the most common physical hazards of concern and the most common sources of those contaminants. The risk of many of these hazards ending up in your product can be controlled through the implementation of good manufacturing practices. However, glass packaging is an example where you are going to have a preventive control for that hazard. Additionally, if metal is a hazard because of metal on metal contact due to mixing, then that's also going to be a preventive control for a physical hazard that you're going to need to implement. So now we'll just talk briefly about the chemical hazards. So there's 3 basic groups of chemical hazards to consider. The first are those that are potentially naturally occurring in ingredients. The next group are those intentionally added chemicals. And then finally, we also have unintentionally added chemicals. So the naturally occurring chemicals are listed here. It includes allergens. So here in the US, we have the 8 big allergens required for labeling: milk, soy, eggs, wheat, tree nuts, peanuts, fish, and shellfish. So if you have an ingredient that contains any of these allergens, you at a minimum must implement an allergen preventive control to ensure that allergen appears on the food label. If you're processing products in the same facility that do not have the same allergenic profile, you'll also have to implement a sanitation preventive control to ensure there's not allergen cross contact in your facility. I already mentioned that there are some molds that can produce mycotoxins if they grow in food. This is primarily associated with grains and tree nuts. So if you're using any of those ingredients in your product, you would implement a supply chain preventive control where you would rely on the supplier primarily to control that mycotoxin hazard in those ingredients that you're receiving from them. So there are certain chemicals used as food additives that have specific upper limits for how much can be added. So adding too much of these food additives, going above that upper limit, can have negative health consequences for the consumer. So the FDA has a list of approved food additives, and you can refer to the upper limits for those food additives on the list. And that's going to be provided in the resource list for the presentation for today. Many chemicals on that additive list are generally recognized as safe or GRAS. And so those don't have specific limits set because they're not known to have any negative health effects. Others, like preservatives, some colors, and other nutrients that are listed here, do have limits on the amount that you can add safely to a processed food. And certainly for organic processors, you would also want to check to make sure that any food additive you're utilizing is also approved for organic use. So check in with your certifier before you're using, any of these food additives in a product, and make sure that, they are on the OMRI list and, labeled for the particular use that you're intending to utilize for your food product. So there's also unintentionally added chemicals that are necessary in the production of food or can't be avoided following GMPs. So there are some tolerances or action levels for specific commodities and specific chemicals. So these would include things like environmental contaminants like heavy metals or chemicals that might be introduced via packaging material. So now that we've reviewed the different types of hazards, I wanted to discuss some examples of preventive controls that might apply for each type of hazard. So for a biological hazard like salmonella associated with eggs used to make a cookie, one might implement a process preventive control like cooking to control for that hazard. There might also be preventive controls for microbial hazards related to product formulation. So for example, acidifying a product to lower the pH, or adding preservatives that will minimize microbial growth. In many cases, when a product is acidified, an additional preventive control, such as pasteurization, is also going to be applied to control for other types of biological hazards. Water activity via drying or salt addition may be a process preventive control for certain products. Or you may have a sanitation preventive control if you've identified environmental pathogens as a potential hazard for your product or process. Allergens, which are chemical hazards, can be controlled by allergen preventive controls, which is essentially allergen labeling. We actually have the highest number of recalls related to allergens, and most of that is related to mislabeling of those products. You may also have a sanitation preventive control to limit the allergen cross-contact between your allergenic products and your non-allergenic products. And for allergens and other chemical hazards like mycotoxins, for example, often a supply chain preventive control is established to minimize the risks of those chemical hazards coming in through raw ingredients or formulated ingredients that you're utilizing. For physical hazards, if metal is an identified hazard, metal detection is a common process preventive control. X-rays are also used as a process preventive control for physical hazards. So for metal, bones, woods, things of that nature. So we'll spend, the remainder of the webinar going through some hazard analysis examples for 3 different products to hopefully make this process a bit more digestible for everyone. But before we get into that, we'll take a pause here for some questions.
Great, thanks, Erin. So we had one question come in during the presentation, and that was someone was wondering whether if dietary supplements are considered human food under the preventative controls rule.
So dietary supplements do not fall under the preventive controls for human food rule. There is a separate regulation that applies to the protection of dietary supplements. I think generally there's a little bit less stringency when it comes to the production of dietary supplements as compared to these processed foods we're discussing here today. But there are certainly requirements that you follow good manufacturing practices, that you are minimizing hazards, but I don't believe there's the same type of preventive controls that need to be implemented for dietary supplements. So they're their own separate category under the FDA regulations.
Great, thank you. And then someone else wrote in asking, can you provide resources for limitations of mycotoxins and yeast and mold?
So I'm going to interpret the question as kind of twofold. Maybe the first is a list of kind of the threshold limits for mycotoxin levels in different ingredients. And so I think that's something that we can certainly dig out and provide to everyone. I don't know off the top of my head what the upper limits for those toxins are in different kinds of commodities. The other question, I think, is related to what would be kind of an acceptable level of yeast and mold in a food product, which is a really complicated question to answer. I have some resources that I can provide just related to microbial testing and limits. So kind of the answer I will give is that it varies significantly by food product, kind of what level, if you're doing end product testing, what level of mold or yeast might be acceptable in that food product. So I will say, the molds that produce toxins are really a small subset of the molds that occur in food. So primarily when you're testing a food for yeast and mold levels, that's related to the product's shelf life or quality. So how long it can sit on a store shelf and not succumb to mold growth or yeast growth that results in spoilage. And so the level is going the acceptable yeast or mold level is really going to vary by product. And there's not a great source of specific information, even related to specific types of products. So I would say, you don't want extremely high levels of these things in any food product, but if you had a very low water activity food, for example, something that has a water activity close to 0.5, you can get away with higher levels of yeast and mold in that end product because the water activity is so low, it's not going to allow for those microorganisms to grow well. But if you had something like a fresh vegetable, or I'm trying to think of a more processed food example, maybe a baked good with a higher water activity level, so something above 0.85, you would want a lower yeast and mold count because that product's just going to spoil more rapidly. So I'll definitely, I can refer you back to some of the content we've developed around that subject, but just know there's not a specific number that you're going to find that tells you, yes, this is exactly the acceptable level for yeast and mold in a food product, because it is highly variable, and that's typically established internally, for a particular product in a particular facility.
Great, thanks. So we're going to take one more question, I think, and then move on. But again, if you have questions that come up along the way, we have many other question and answer breaks. So someone wrote in wondering for a food safety plan or hazard analysis is required. Let me start again. Is a food safety plan or hazard analysis required for each individual product you manufacture? And so if you are a manufacturer that's, has 50 different products you need, can you have a general one, or do you need one for each type? And the person who wrote in does dietary supplements. So I think we answered that kind of. They fall under other rules, but I think in general, that's sort of a, under the preventative controls rule, what do you do if you're manufacturing 50 types of jam or other things?
That's a really good question. So it's under the regulation, it does, specify if you have products that have like hazards, then you can have one blanket hazard analysis food safety plan that applies to those like products. So if you're making jam and you have a strawberry jam, a blueberry jam, a peach jam, so you're using high acid fruit in all of your jams, you're utilizing, a process where you are meeting the standard of identity for jellies and jams, which essentially means that you're adding the same amount of sugar to all of those jams, so they meet a specific water activity level, then you can lump all those products together in the same hazard analysis and food safety plan. You don't need something different. But if you're making something, so let's say you have in addition to your fruit jams, you also have a pepper jelly, and to make that pepper jelly, you're acidifying the jelly during that process. That has a different set of hazards compared to your fruit-based jam. So in that case, you would have one hazard analysis, one set of preventive controls that would apply to your fruit jams, but then you'd have a separate hazard analysis and set of preventive controls that would apply to that acidified pepper jelly you're making. So yes, there is room to lump like products, but if say you're making cookies and there's chocolate chip cookies but then you have a chocolate chip cookie that has walnuts. That walnut is a unique allergenic hazard associated with your chocolate chip walnut cookies that's not in your chocolate chip cookie. Then you'd have to separate out. So you do have to, you have to take a look at everything, but you can certainly lump products together in the same hazard analysis, food safety plan that have the same hazard profile.
Great, thank you. So I think we're gonna move on to the next section, but again, if you have more questions, just send them in and we'll get to them at a later question and answer break.
Great. So the first example that we're going to go through today is for a blueberry packing house. So this particular example was developed by the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, and it's one of the model food safety plans that we can utilize during the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual Training. So if you're planning to attend that training with us in the future, this is one of the examples we'll go through as part of that training here. I'm just gonna highlight really the hazard analysis piece of the plan. We're not gonna go through the preventive control development, validation, verification piece of the plan today. So for each example we go through today, I'll provide the product description, the flow diagram, and the process narrative for each one of the products so you can get an understanding of the product and the process before we get into the hazard analysis for the particular product. So the product description for the blueberry packing operations shown here, it describes that these are fresh, ready-to-eat blueberries that are packed in 6-ounce single-use clamshells that are then bulk packaged onto cardboard flats. And the intended consumers are the general public. And so these are sold to retail markets or food service operations. And then it states that these blueberries should be stored refrigerated, but it's specified that this is for quality and not safety. And so this is really common for fresh produce that they're going to be, that those commodities recommended for refrigerated storage that is tied to quality and not safety. And then here they also state that these should be washed before using, and that a lot code for each container is, or a lot code is placed on the clamshell, as well as that bulk packaging in the cardboard. So here's the flow diagram, and you can see this is an overview of the process. Flow diagrams really, really helpful in conducting your hazard analysis because they lay out the process step by step, which is what you're going to have to do during the hazard analysis. So for the blueberries, these blueberries are received in bulk, and then they're sent to a forced air cooler prior to being put in longer term cooler storage. You can also see they outline the step for receiving the packaging. So you want to have a step for every item that you receive that is going in the product. So that includes ingredients as well as packaging. And this packaging is then, once it's received, placed in dry storage. So after the cooler storage, these blueberries are sorted and then graded. And at both of these steps, any low quality fruit is going to be diverted for juice processing. So any fruit that's not, suitable for fresh berry sales, diverted for juice processing. And then we're going to assume a separate external business from this processor. So after grading, the blueberries are packed into the clamshells, and then they get sent through a metal detector. And then after passing through the metal detector, these individual clamshells are going to be bulk packaged and then sent to cold storage prior to shipping. So if any blueberries are deemed low quality prior to shipping, again, they may be reworked into juice, or if they're totally past the quality to be used for juice, they're going to be discarded. So after that last cold storage step, these blueberries are going to be shipped out to the different markets. So the process narrative, this is another piece of the food safety plan. This provides more details on each one of the steps that's outlined in the flow diagram. So here I'm just going to highlight some of the things from the process narrative that maybe aren't captured as well in the flow diagram. So you can see at the receiving blueberries step that the blueberries and harvest bins are inspected. There's also a bulk goods report that's cross-checked with an approved supplier list and lot number that's matched to the pallet tag. So this is kind of that supplier verification piece. Also, when they're receiving packaging here, they're looking at the certificate of conformance to ensure that the packing materials meet food safety and regulatory requirements. And then another detail I wanted to pull out is that during packaging, the lot code on the clamshell is cross-checked to ensure that it can be linked to the lot of bulk berries that was received and subsequently used to fill those clamshells. So traceability, being able to follow the food 1-2 steps forward, 1-2 steps back. So I know we went through that really quickly, but I wanted to poll the group. So based on that product description, the flow diagram, the process narrative, what potential hazards associated with the specific step of receiving berries stands out to you? So when you receive those blueberries, would you identify biological hazards, pathogenic microorganisms potentially being present in those blueberries? Would you identify a chemical hazard, in this case, excessive pesticide residue being associated with those blueberries at this step? Would you identify a physical hazard, say metal birdshot in these blueberries at that receiving step? Would you identify all of these, none of these, or are you not sure? So just give another minute or two for this one. All right, so I'll end and share. So great job. We'll get into this, but it is all three of those hazards. So at the receiving blueberry stage, there are biological, chemical, and physical hazards I identified. So we'll get into the hazard analysis piece now, and you can see which of these three hazards identified actually require preventive control to be implemented. So we'll transition into the hazard analysis for the blueberry packing house. And I just wanted to go back through this process of hazard analysis that has two major steps. The first step is this hazard identification. So going through every step in that process and identifying, are there hazards associated with this particular step? And then the second part of the hazard analysis is evaluating whether or not the hazards you identified in that first step during hazard analysis require a preventive control. So this includes assessing the severity of the hazard, the likelihood that that hazard is going to occur, whether the hazard is going to be adequately controlled by your good manufacturing practices, or ultimately whether that hazard needs to be addressed in-house, meaning do we need to control for that hazard by implementing a preventive control in our own process. So typically a form is used for hazard analysis. There are some different versions out there, but they essentially all capture the same information. So this is the form that the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance developed. So in any form, the form is going to list each individual step from the flow diagram or process narrative. And then next to each one of those individual steps, there'll be columns that allow you to list all the potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards associated at each step. A column for your evaluation decision, which is, does this hazard require a preventive control or not? Another column that is the justification for that evaluation decision. So if a preventive control is required, why that is. If it's not, why not? There's also a column that if you are implementing a preventive control, what that preventive control is going to be. You will also have a lot more documentation in the food safety plan related to the details of that preventive control. But even in the hazard analysis step, you need to call out what kind of preventive control you're applying. And then the last column is, are you applying that preventive control at that particular step where you've identified that hazard requiring the control? So there's many instances where you're going to identify a hazard coming in with a raw ingredient. You're going to be implementing a preventive control that's actually going to be later on in your process. So, and we have lots of examples of that here today. So for the blueberries, for the step of receiving the bulk blueberries, you can see there are the biological, chemical, and physical hazards all identified. So when you do identify a hazard, you want to be very specific about the type of biological, chemical, or physical hazards. You don't just want to say, yes, biological hazard, and not have any description there. So here for the biological hazards, human pathogens such as Salmonella and hepatitis A are indicated. And these hazards were deemed to require a preventive control because blueberries have been shown in the past to be contaminated with these two microbial pathogens. And so the type of preventive control that's going to be implemented in this case is a supply chain preventive control. And this is also, very common for people sourcing fresh produce to utilize the supply chain preventive control, where you're relying on the grower to be implementing processes on their farm to reduce food safety risks. So this could be, adhering to the FSMA produce safety rule. This could be, going through other types of food safety audits. And so, if you are sourcing produce and you're not going to be doing any kind of processing of that produce, or I guess implementing a kill step in-house, then most likely you would be relying on the supply chain preventive control and the growers' food safety practices to mitigate the risk associated with that produce. So they've also identified a chemical hazard, being pesticides and other crop production chemicals. However, for this particular hazard they identified, the preventive control was deemed not to be required because these crops are grown domestically, and available data indicates that most growers in the US are in compliance with pesticide residue limits. So an example here where a hazard was identified but did not require a preventive control to be implemented. And then they identified a physical hazard, which is bird shot. And this particular hazard did require a preventive control in this group's eyes, and that's because bird shot can be found occasionally in intact berries. And in this case, they're going to be implementing a process preventive control, which is metal detection, that is going to be implemented at a step later in the process. So after they've packaged these berries and they're going to be running them through the metal detector. So although the hazard was identified at this particular step and they've described the kind of preventive control to be implemented, that preventive control is a few steps later in their process. So that preventive controls implemented not at the receiving step, but later on in their process. No hazards identified with receiving packaging or dry storage. So here are the steps for the forced air cooling, cooler storage, sorting and grading. And you can see at all these steps, environmental pathogens are identified as a potential biological hazard. And in these cases, the hazard analysis team deemed that these environmental pathogens did not require preventive control because this is a dry operation. And so for produce in particular, where we're concerned about the environmental pathogen Listeria monocytogenes building up in a processing facility, that particular pathogen is more prevalent in wet operations. So places where you have a lot of water being used. And so, I think the justification here is clear, but they could have also said, yes, we're going to implement a preventive control at this step. So I think in either case, whether they're saying this risk is low because it's a dry operation, we're adhering to GMPs, or we're going to implement a sanitation preventive control, ensuring that cleaning and sanitation practices are in place, either under your GMPs or under your preventive controls is really, really important for minimizing the risks of environmental pathogens. I will say though, if you flag this as requiring a sanitation preventive control, there is much more documentation that's going to be required in that process, which is likely why they didn't implement that preventive control here. They also flagged during the grading step human pathogen contamination via insanitary handling, i.e. food handler contamination, being identified as a potential hazard. But again, this was determined to not require preventive control because if current good manufacturing practices are implemented, then any food handler is going to be following those proper personal hygiene practices, hand washing, making sure their clothing's clean, not working when they're sick, and that will adequately minimize that risk. You can also see they've identified some chemical hazards. So ammonia from refrigeration, excessive cleaning and sanitizing chemical residues on surfaces. But in both of these, cases, no preventive controls required because again, these things should be covered by good manufacturing practices. So equipment maintenance should mitigate the risk of, ammonia from refrigeration being an issue. Sanitary operations, having those set SOPs for cleaning and sanitizing should minimize the risk of there being excessive cleaning or sanitizing chemicals on these surfaces. And then just what I'll highlight here on this last piece of the hazard analysis is the process preventive control of metal detection that's implemented here. So we identified it when we received the berries earlier on. That preventive control is implemented when the berries run through the metal detector. I will say also that process preventive controls, unlike the other three types of preventive controls, so sanitation, allergens, supply chain, the process preventive controls do require validation studies, meaning you have to prove that they work to control the hazard that you've identified. So for metal detection, this could include, artificially contaminating your product with various types of metals at various sizes and running that contaminated product through the metal detector to see if it gets rejected. But again, we're going to have a webinar on validation, and we'll get more into the weeds as to what types of studies or things you would have to do in-house for those validation studies. And then just to end this example, I'll highlight that shipping can also be a source of contamination. So the shipping vehicle can be a source of contamination. So if you use your own vehicle for transportation, good manufacturing practices need to be implemented to reduce that risk. If you're using a transport company, there is another rule under the Food Safety Modernization Act, the Sanitary Transportation Rule, that food transporters must adhere to. So if you are using a external company for transportation of your product, you want to ensure that they're in compliance with the Sanitary Transportation Rule in that case. So time for some questions before we jump into the next example.
Wonderful, thank you. So we did have a number of questions come in. One was just a clarifying question on the chart that you were showing, wondering if it's required for hazard analysis to add a column for the risk assessment score.
So there's no standardized form that you have to use for the hazard analysis. I haven't seen any that have a risk assessment score on them. You know, it's typically just each step in the process, identifying the hazards, flagging those that require a preventive control, and then, you know, the justification for that. I would imagine maybe the risk analysis score could fit into that justification column. But again, you don't have to use one of these forms if you know that's your preference. It's not required. I think it's just what's been developed to be the most useful in keeping all of this information straight and easily digestible for folks coming in and looking through your hazard analysis.
Great, thanks. And then there's another person who grows and processes mushrooms that was wondering if they need to include mushroom toxins as a chemical hazard in their hazard analysis.
I don't, I mean, that's going to be variety specific, right? So if you're not working, and I suspect you're not, you know, growing any mushrooms that, you know, are known to be the toxin producers, then you wouldn't need to include that there.
Great, thanks. So we're going to take one more question and then move on. And someone wrote in saying, I've heard the word rework used for production interpretation or interruption, so equipment failure, packaging failure, that type of thing. Can you briefly address rework in food safety plans?
Yeah, so so in the blueberry example, that rework was kind of just related to the blueberries quality, right? If these blueberries weren't suitable for fresh market sale, they were gonna be reworked into juice, which is, you know, common for fresh produce. But for other kinds of processed foods, typically when rework comes up is when you have some deviation from a preventive control that's been implemented. So an example might be if you're, let's say, going back to salsa, you're making salsa and you're pasteurizing that salsa at a specific time and temperature. You run a lot of product, you go back and review the records related to that pasteurization step and realize we didn't meet our critical limit. We didn't, meet the scheduled process for thermally processing this salsa. So there's typically, two things you can do with that product. The first is rework, which means you have a set plan. If you have a product that deviates from that pasteurization process, you can send it through the pasteurizer again, where it meets that critical limit you've established for the pasteurization process. So you're too low on the temperature the first run, you take that salsa out, you run it back through that pasteurizer again, recalibrated to the correct temperature. You could also, of course, destroy the product, which is, not preferable, but that also happens a lot for products that might not be suitable for rework. There may be instances where a product can be, used in some other type of application. So it could actually, reworked into and incorporated into another product that's going through a different process that would be that kill step. For allergens, a lot of times it is related to packaging labeling. So you might run a lot of product, labels are applied, someone does an inspection. Oh, this chocolate chip cookie is missing the dairy allergen on the label. So then that lot of product would go through and get relabeled, and that would also be considered rework. So, generally it's this term that applies to if you have something that happens in your process where you've deviated from a preventive control you have established. It's another like a offshoot process that you can use to kind of recycle that product so it doesn't have to be destroyed. But that recycling process still has to address food safety issues. So it could be, sending again through the pasteurizer, or, depending on the product, something more complicated. But that, I hope that's clear, but that's generally what it means. You do see that term thrown around quite a bit.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the clarification. And it seems to having a word that has multiple uses can get confusing. So I think,
yes.
Thank you for walking through all of that. So I think we'll move on, and just a time check too. We have a little under 20 minutes for the rest of the webinar, but we can move on to our next hazard analysis plan.
All right. So the next example, and the next two are going to be kind of brief. This is related to a produce aggregator or food hub. And so this was an example developed with funding from a USDA food safety outreach program grant to support food hubs with FSMA preventive controls for human rule implementation. And so in this example, so I'm using here just kind of food hubs as primarily a produce aggregator. So this particular food hub is only aggregating produce. They don't have any other processed foods. They also aren't aggregating any allergenic types of produce like almonds or walnuts. They supply the produce to schools, restaurants, and grocery stores. Again, no allergens in the facility, and the produce is refrigerated for quality, but that's not related to food safety. Here's another kind of variation on the flow diagram. I think it's a little bit more difficult to look at than the previous one. But here a food hub receives packaging and either stores that packaging material in-house, or in this case, they may directly distribute packaging to farmers after they do an inspection and cross-check of the certificate of conformance of that packaging. Farmers deliver produce themselves to the food hubs, and the staff there upon receipt make sure that those growers are on their verified supplier list, and that list includes growers that have gone through some type of food safety auditing. The produce is then moved to its appropriate storage location. In this food hub, they're doing some produce repackaging, so taking produce out of that box that they received from the grower, building a new box. So they're in that packing area, they're cleaning and sanitizing before they're handling the produce. They're packing orders in new wax boxes, and they're labeled for traceability, and then returning those newly packed boxes to the appropriate storage location. And then finally, those repacked boxes are aggregated and loaded onto a delivery vehicle for distribution. So the process narrative is here. It's actually the only thing I wanted to highlight here is that is related to the packaging. And here it's specified that they're either going to be using new wax coated boxes or a gently used wax coated box with a plastic liner. So we've heard actually from a lot of growers and folks working in these food hubs that, you know, there's a lot of interest in reusing these boxes, most of them reused boxes. You know, what are the food safety implications? And you know, the solution we came upon was adding that plastic liner to those boxes, so you don't have produce that's directly, you know, contacting any potential contaminant that might be on that used box. So now moving into the hazard analysis, you know, not a ton of hazards identified in this particular operation. The major one that we identified for these types of operations, that, you know, specifically those that are only receiving produce that has no allergens associated. So again, no tree nuts, no peanuts. The main preventive control required will be that supply chain preventive control for ensuring that the produce coming into the facility is the hazards have been minimized there. And so the food hub would then need to establish what food safety standards they're going to require of their grower to help minimize those risks. So again, this could be requiring compliance with the produce safety rule or other food safety audit schemes. But we found in many cases, these food hubs were working with growers that were exempt from the produce safety rule. And so one of the resources that you're going to receive on that resource list is a supply chain verification tool that I developed along with Community Alliance with Family Farmers that specifically addresses you know, that issue. If you are working with a supplier that is exempt to the produce safety rule, or maybe is exempt from the preventive controls rule, what should you be doing? What kind of documentation should you be asking of them? And there's actually some templates there for you to utilize as well, if this is a scenario that applies to your business. Again, like with the blueberries, environmental pathogens are flagged here as a hazard identified during that cooler storage. Again, the justification for not requiring a preventive control is that this is a dry operation. But I also just want to point out that coolers are known to have condensation or standing water, and this can be a potential harbor site for these environmental pathogens. So again, equipment maintenance, cleaning and sanitation, which fall under your GMPs, are all going to be really important for minimizing those risks. And just again, to reiterate on transportation, if you're using your own trucks, making sure that those are being properly maintained, clean and sanitized. And if you're working with an external transportation company, verifying that they are compliant with the sanitary transportation rule under FSMA is really, really important. So I have another question break here, but I think I'll just jump into the next example because it is a little bit different. So this is a chocolate chip cookie, a really basic type of food processing, but I think even though we've all made these before at home, when you think about it from the hazard analysis standpoint, it gets complicated pretty fast. So this example was developed by the University of Massachusetts Amherst. They have a really great program to support small processors with food safety practice implementation. So they're a great resource too if you're looking for specific product guidance information. So for this chocolate chip cookies product description, you can see this is a shelf-stable product that has a water activity of less than 0.50. So this is considered a low water activity food. You can see the ingredients are all listed here, but they also call out ingredients that are allergenic in this product description, which is really good. So wheat, milk, and egg are in these cookies. Always good if you have particular hazards or parameters like water activity or pH for your product, that you list that in the product description. So it's really easy for someone coming into your facility to get a snapshot kind of the risks associated with your product. For the flow diagram, you can see here that they're receiving refrigerated ingredients, which includes their egg and butter. They're also have a separate step for receiving their shelf-stable ingredients and another step for receiving their packaging and also labels. Following receipt, the ingredients are mixed, cookies are formed, then they're frozen, racked, baked, and cooled, followed by packaging, labeling, palletizing, and storing. So in the process narrative, it does call out that they use suppliers that they have vetted for implementing food safety practices through auditing. So there's an option to go do the audits yourself if you have that kind of background to be able to do a food safety audit of your suppliers. Or there are a lot of different third-party audits that can be used to verify that the supplier of your ingredients are giving you both safe and high quality ingredients on a routine basis. So here's the process for storing, mixing, forming, freezing, racking, baking, the rest of the process. And you can see in the mixing step, the last sentence there outlines that the tools and utensils are inspected post-mixing for signs of metal shearing. So they don't have a metal detector here. They're inspecting their equipment to ensure they don't have metal shearing during their process to control that metal hazard. They also specify the exact weight of the dough they're using for each cookie here, specifying how many trays go on a rack prior to going in their oven, the number of rotations of those racks in the oven, and the time and temperature are specified. So, kind of to give you a sense of the type of information if you are implementing a cooking preventive control, that's important. And they also call out here that the cookies are packed by hand. So last poll here. So based on the cookie information provided, what kind of preventive controls do you think would be associated with this cookie? So would we need a process preventive control, which is our baking step to kill pathogens? Would we need the process preventive control? I think I already said, which is metal detection. And would we need that allergen preventive control, which would be the label verification? So responses rolling in. You guys are pros at this already. Yes, we need all of these preventive controls that you all identified for the production of this cookie. So receiving ingredients, there are biological chemical hazards associated with receiving eggs and also the butter. So there's allergens associated with both of those ingredients, and then biological hazards associated with eggs. So these are pasteurized eggs, but even though they are pasteurized, they are still known to harbor salmonella occasionally. So most folks that are receiving pasteurized eggs also implement their own process preventive control for those that salmonella hazard associated with eggs. For the shelf-stable ingredients, unfortunately, flour has a lot. So there have been pathogens associated with raw flour. It's also a wheat allergen. And then they've also flagged metal as a potential hazard coming in with their flour. So here they have a process control, metal detection for metal and flour. I would have implemented a supply chain preventive control where you're working with that supplier of the flour to have them do that metal detection and provide you a certificate of conformance or analysis showing that flour does not contain any metal fragments when it comes into your facility. I want to highlight the mixing step here. So I already mentioned that anytime you have mixing, you're likely going to be identifying a physical hazard that requires a preventive control. So if you can't implement metal detection via a metal detector in your facility, you can kind of get around that using a pre and post inspection of equipment to make sure that you don't have any metal shearing related to that mixing step. And then just in the interest of time, I know we're running a bit short. The baking step here is the process preventive control for biological hazards. And again, we're going to have the webinar and validation, but a validation study is required to show that the time and temperature used is going to kill the pathogens of concern. And so those cooking parameters chosen should be based on existing data showing that kill, but also you would need to have some in-house data to show that you're achieving those temperatures inside of your cookie, which is why they're calling out the exact weight of each cookie, the rotations of the cookie within that oven to make sure that the cookies that might be in the cold spot of the oven are also getting adequately heated. So validation is something that can be a little bit challenging, especially for someone just starting out in the industry. And then with allergens, if you don't have those unique allergens, it's all for, unique allergens in your facility. If you're running multiple products, the allergen preventive control is related to that label. In this example, they're having someone external print the labels. So when they receive the labels, they're doing a verification that the allergen is on the label when they receive the label, but then again, they're checking that label when they apply it to the actual cookie, to the product, to give that double check that the allergen is on that label. So again, allergens are a leading cause of recalls here in the US, and most of those are related to simply putting the wrong label on a package. So having multiple checks is really important for that allergen preventive control. So happy to take questions. I know we're right up on at the end of time, but I'm sure this is a topic that again is complicated. So I know there's probably lots of questions that folks have.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I agree. It's always difficult to do these types of trainings in a shorter amount of time. So thank you for going over and showing lots of examples and how different people have addressed hazard analysis in the example food safety plans. So just a note, we are recording this and we will be sending it out. So if you need to hop off now, you can always watch the recording and hear a little more question and answer. So I think to start, we've been talking a lot about food safety, preventative controls, and how to address those. But organic producers also need to think about commingling and not mixing organic product with non-organic products. So the organic folks on the line, Jacob or Anna or Scott, would you be willing to speak a little bit just about some best practices for reducing commingling, particularly in processors who are processing both organic and non-organic product?
Yeah, sure. Well, I know that a lot of organic producers in packing houses will run organic kind of first thing in the morning. So the first part of their day is gonna run the organic on a clean set of equipment. So they had a clean break on the night shift. All the equipment was sanitized, and then they'll run their organics and then they'll run their conventional. So that's one way. And depending on the product, some folks will run a purge on like hard to clean equipment, and the purge product cannot be called organic. I kind of specialize in food safety on the farm, so that's about as much as know about facility breaks. Maybe somebody else has.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. And just to reiterate, it sounds like if you're running both organic and non-organic, one way to do that is to set up your process so you're running organic in the morning, and you're basically, after you've cleaned everything, the night before, it's ready for the organic. And then also possibly some purging. Scott, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think we kind of covered, Erin covered the just always contact your certifier to update any sort of materials that you're intending to use, because I think sometimes things that are commonly used in conventional runs may not be used in, maybe prohibited in organic. So just, we say that every time, always communicate is better instead of having to throw something to conventional and lose the premium on it. Less, it happens a little bit less, but just know that if you see something that has been petitioned to be used, for instance, with the National Organic Standards Board, even if the board says they approve it, it has to go through rulemaking before it's actually able to be used. Again, that's kind of more of a unlikely but not unheard of scenario that we've seen. So just, again, the communication with the certifier really nips those issues in the bud.
Great, thanks. Yes, always best practice to check in before using anything new. So moving on to some other questions. I think one, Erin, I would be good to do maybe just a little recap. We had one question come in asking if you could just talk about the exemptions to the preventative control rule, or maybe if folks might be in an exempt category where they could find some information. And then another question that also came in was just, there's a lot of different processes, the difference between good manufacturing practices and preventative controls and HACCP, and what would be another good area of information to help folks just sort of figure out what they need to do and where they fall in all of these different food safety practices.
Well, I will just say I feel you. It's so complicated, and I think you know, I still feel like I learn something new every day when it comes to the regulations. But I guess I'll just start specifically talking about preventive controls for human food rule. There's many different exemptions that exist. I think maybe in our first webinar, we covered those in depth. But there's exemptions if you're a retail food establishment, for example, if you're a nonprofit, if you're a farm, and you know you're fully exempt from this regulation. There's also farm mix type facilities, which if you are doing some of the low risk processing activities on your farm, and I believe you have to be under $500,000 in annual sales, you're exempt from the hazard analysis piece, but you still have to implement good manufacturing practices and register with FDA as a food processing facility. If you are not connected with a farm and you're a processor that has less than 500 employees, you have less than $1 million adjusted for inflation, I don't know the current number, in annual sales, then you would be considered a qualified facility. So like the farm mix type facility, you would not have to do the hazard analysis, implement preventive controls, but you would have to follow good manufacturing practices, register with FDA. And in both those cases too, I should mention, you also have to adhere with your local or state food safety regulations. And so I don't think if you're a food processor and you're not doing some of those activities categorized as low risk under a mixed type facility, you're still, for your state and local regulations, likely going to have to do the hazard analysis and implement some controls, though it may not be completely analogous to what we went over today. We already talked about, dietary supplements. They're their own separate thing that's exempt. As far as resources to help you navigate the process, I developed a couple of years ago a flow diagram for processors in California to kind of walk you through the different scenarios, all the way from you're a farm to your cottage food processor, folding in some of our state regulations and the federal regulations. I think there are some great resources on the Washington State Department of Ag's website. I've been really impressed with all the resources they have there. So, if you're in California or Washington, I would, refer you kind of either to the UC Food Safety website to look at starting the food business, that portion of our website, or WSDA's website in Washington. For other folks, if you're, not in those two states, I think there is some good guidance related to the federal regulations, but just know every state has its own set of, local state food safety regulations. And so those are gonna be variable. You can always, I think reach out to folks in extension like Stephanie and myself. We're always happy to, if you're not in California, but you need a connection in another state, I might know someone in one of those other states. So reach out, or you may be able to find those people on your, local extension websites too.
Great, thank you. Yes, there are a lot of good resources out there, and also people that you can talk to. So I think sometimes that can be helpful too. So Stephanie, I don't know if you just want to jump in and see if there's anything to add specifically for Washington growers, and then we'll wrap things up, or processors, I should say.
Yeah, I don't have anything additional to add that specifically applies to Washington processors, except, make sure that if you're covered under the FSMA rule, just make sure that you are registered with WSDA, and then also, feel free to reach out to them for support, for processing support. And then also extension, as Erin said, is here to help as well. So we are here to help you with all of this. So putting together, food safety plans, doing the hazard analysis, those sorts of things. So we can provide assistance and resources.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you all again for being here. And I think we're going to do just one more poll for the folks that are still online. As Erin mentioned, we have some trainings coming up as part of this project over the next year, and just wanted to get a sense on what folks were interested in. So if you want to take a little time to fill that out. And while you're doing that, I'll just note that we have a few more trainings in the series coming up. So you can find information about those on the CCOF website. And then also, if you missed any of the past trainings, or sometimes folks register for a webinar and then can't attend, you can always find the recordings on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And yeah, it looks like there's a diversity of interests, definitely good manufacturing practices, have some high votes there, as well as produce safety grower training and some preventative controls training. So thank you very much. We appreciate your feedback. You also have an opportunity to take one more quick evaluation when you jump out. So you can give us some more ideas, tell us how we did. And it's super helpful to hear from you all. So thanks again, Erin. Thank you for the nice walkthrough of another complicated topic. And we'll see you all in a couple weeks for our validation webinar. So have a good day.